On behalf of Crosscheck Media and Biz Talk Today TV, welcome everyone to the Money Path. I am your host, Todd Schoenberger. Joining me today is Michael Green. He is the Chief Strategist and Portfolio Manager at Simplify Asset Management. Michael, thank you for joining the show. I have to start off talking about your Substack article regarding poverty. It's created quite the ruckus out there. And you are arguing that you were saying in your article that the current poverty line at 32,000 and change should be lifted and is realistically $140,000. What's the single biggest misconception that people have when they see that number?
Well, so first, thank you for having me. Second, remember that there's all types of poverty lines, depending on this construction in your family. So the 32,000, the one that I'm referencing, is a family of four, two workers, two children. And when I dug into this, when I actually started doing the analysis on what it costs a family of four to survive in today's world, I was really blown away looking at many regions around the country that number appears to be much closer to $140,000, with primary components of that being obviously housing, which has increased dramatically in cost. You ultimately want to have, if you have a family, have children in a relatively safe environment with relatively good schools, et cetera. That's not something that should be exclusively the province of the rich. But even more important, it turns out, are things like childcare, which historically wouldn't have even been an issue. You would have had family members to do it. A wife would have stayed home. There would have been neighbors where other mothers would have been around to watch after children, or in many ways, children were somewhat self-sufficient. Today, that option really doesn't exist. And so the minute you decide to have a two-income family, you are entering into a world state in which you need to have childcare. That childcare is extraordinarily expensive. Average cost on a nationwide basis, about $26,000 for two children. In the area that I was looking in New Jersey, about an hour outside of New York City, it worked out to $32,000, which in and of itself is enough to exceed the poverty line, according to the U.S. government.
So let's unpack the child care then. So taking a look at that number, you're saying 26,000 and that's for two children?
It's 26,000 for two children on a nationwide basis. It works out to about 13 to 15,000 for one child.
And is that for the child who is younger, or are they in middle school, high school? Trying to get an idea.
Yeah, so the direct comparison there would be children that are below the age of going to school. And so one of the valid components is that that's a temporary phenomenon. But it's a temporary phenomenon that hits families at the absolute most important point where they're making the decision, do we form this family or do we not form this family? Right? You can't like decide, okay, well, I'm just going to borrow a whole bunch of money for the first 5 years, because that's also a time period in which you're trying to pay off student loans. You're trying to buy a house. You're trying to pay off car loans for vehicles that you've acquired because you're relatively young. It's an area it's a time period in which you don't have the resources to exceed that level unless you're able to tap into social capital, meaning wealthy parents or parental resources, or you just got lucky.
Right, right. So, and that's for a family of four. So, what about on the individual level, though? I mean,
Well,
what is,
so this is one of the great ironies is that what's really expensive is having children. So if you're making $80,000 as an individual, which is roughly the median household income in the United States, you're skipping a lot of the expenses that are typically associated with childcare. Among other things, you'll have a smaller place to live because you don't need a separate bedroom for the children. You're going to not have to incur the child care costs. Your food costs will take on a different form, right? You may have more issues with planning small meals, but I promise you, nothing really shocks you like trying to put high quality food on the table for your children. You discover that that's actually pretty expensive relative to other stuff.
yeah, that was
Um,
no question about it. And absolutely. So, what happens then as the child gets older, though? I mean, they get into sports. I mean, how does the equation change?
Yeah, you're hitting all the critical points that I think people who have not raised children, which is again one of the really interesting divides, this basically the reaction split to people typically who were very old who had no concept of these costs saying those can't possibly be right. If you were to try to do this in Dubuque, you'd discover that prices were a lot less. Well, there's just not as many jobs in Dubuque, right? I mean, so let's be really candid about that.
Right.
The second component is those who are at the younger end, who had never even contemplated the child care, would often respond and say something along the lines of what we just discussed. Well, I make $85,000 and I'm fine. I'm saving money, right? Having children is a choice. Absolutely, it is a choice. And it's a choice that fewer and fewer people are making primarily because of the economic pressure.
Right. So your argument is about really about affordability. I
That's
mean,
exactly correct. Yeah.
so when we get into the Fed, we'll segue into the Fed. The Fed starts their 2-day meeting today. Tomorrow is decision day on what they're going to do with rates. So interest rates. So with that, what you have this part where the Fed says, well, inflation is somewhat in check. You have households that are saying it costs 27% more to live in America than it did 5 years ago. So the question is, who's right, and can the Fed do anything about it?
Well, the interesting thing is both are right, right? So, and this is candidly one of the ways in which I came to this path, right? As a finance professional, as a trained economist, my reaction to statements about inflation are, well, inflation means something very particular, the year over year change in the general price level. And so if it goes from 100 to 120, that's a 20% change in price level. If it then goes up by 2% the next year, we're looking at something like 124.4 would be the next level in terms of where that would price. And many people would look at that and be like, okay, so that's 24% inflation. No, that's 2% inflation
Hmm.
from this point forward, right? We're adjusting the price level by its rate of change. Where the affordability crisis comes in is candidly something that I was insulated from by virtue of financial success, but also because of understanding. And so that's one of the reasons, again, why I write my Substack, et cetera, is to force myself to think in an intellectually curious way about problems that I may not fully understand. This just happened to be one that caught people's attention. And what really is happening with the affordability crisis is that American households are saying, look, my income is 90, my expenses are 100, therefore I'm underwater, right?
Hmm.
And the Federal Reserve is saying, well, wait a second, wages were up 2% last year and prices were only up 2.5%. So you really shouldn't be that upset anymore. We don't have the 6, 7, 8, 9% inflation that was causing this stress. And there's
Hmm.
a little bit of truth to that, but if you actually just think about the math behind that, if I currently have income of 90 and expenses of 100 and my wages rise by 2%, right? So that's 1.02 times 90 is going to put me at 91.8. The expenses go up by 2.5%, doesn't seem that crazy, right? But all of a sudden my 100 is now at 102.5. And the difference between those two, I'm actually further underwater than I was before. I've made no progress. Yes, inflation has slowed down, but I owe more money this year than I did last year. And I find myself in a worse situation. These people are drowning, is what they're telling us. This is the lower end of the K-shaped economy. And they're telling us increasingly that they are stressed and increasingly unproductive because of that stress.
Right, right. And I would imagine that the feedback that you received from this was probably both on both sides. So, but with that, I'll just talk about politics then. Is there anything that Congress can help with households at this level?
Oh, absolutely. There's a million things that can be done, which is part of the problem. So, in terms of the political response, most of it I would characterize in the framework of uncharitable reading of the issue, right? So, there are many who decided to focus on the 140,000 and whether it was 140,000 or 125,000 or 95,000. The answer really doesn't matter all that much when the when the federal poverty level is 32,000, right? They're so far off that it's absurd.
Hmm.
And what the article was really about was not the 140, but about the benefits cliff that is created by that too low poverty line, which is where benefits start to be taken away from families that are receiving support and creating what I called the valley of death, where the conditions don't change very much between about $40,000 of income and $100,000 because you lose food support, you lose housing support, you lose childcare support as your incomes rise. Those have to be replaced with cash outflow expenditures. and the government's no longer helping, giving you a marginal tax rate or effectively a marginal cash flow rate that means you're not making any tangible improvement. That can absolutely be addressed. It would require a somewhat holistic review. The political response has been really interesting because on the left, they are understandably concerned that by raising the issue of those in the middle, I'm distracting from the genuine needs of those on the very poor side. And I think that's a valid concern, right?
Hmm.
And on the right, they're incredibly terrified about a reintroduction of tax policy and progressive taxation and a discussion of who's actually paying what taxes, et cetera, because one, they understandably want to protect their existing position, but two, they also don't want it exposed how badly they've just been lying about the realities.
Right, right. Michael, my question is, what is your intent with this article? Because you're bringing up an area that really Simplify has. I mean, I don't think Simplify would have. I mean, it's great that you have that education, you could provide that knowledge, but you're not. It doesn't really exactly change the revenue stream for the company.
No, if anything, actually, it damages my recommendations and my discussions around this in many ways damage my personal income statement and balance sheet far worse than almost anyone else's. And I think that's actually an important test, right? What I'm actually proposing and discussing would hurt me as much or more than almost anyone else. Things like the removal of deductibility of corporate interest expense. I run a high yield fund, right? Like that's going to be really interesting to try to navigate that type of dynamic or hiking taxes on people who make significantly more money and are in the top 1%, which is really what the proposal is about, hurts
Right,
me, right? Like, my wife in some ways is like, you're a terrible father, you're a terrible husband and father, but you're a wonderful human being, right?
right.
Those are, realities. The Substack has always been about, and it continues a tradition I've done for roughly 20 plus years of writing on a weekly basis to explore my thinking. And for the past several weeks, I got sucked down the rabbit hole of trying to understand what was actually going on in the economy. It was in response to a series of mocking tweets that were put out by people on both sides of the spectrum, similar to the reaction that my work has engendered, challenging an observation somebody made in the 1950s, a single income earner could afford X, right?
Hmm.
And I looked at this and I said, well, what's the most interesting thing about this is the coordinated response and the mocking tone that people were taking on this forced me to kind of say, hey, wait a second, maybe the establishment is actually not telling the truth about what's going on here. If they react this violently to a relatively minor complaint, what's really going on here? And
Hmm.
so, from my standpoint, truth has its own rewards. Um, will it change the way that we invest at Simplify? Only if we start to see meaningful changes in approach and policy. But this is one of the real challenges that you have as a portfolio manager is you simultaneously have to have a sense for what is true and right. And then you also have to have a sense in the Keynesian beauty contest of what other people believe. And so
Hmm.
the process of discovery of what do they actually believe? Is it correct? Is it true? And does raising awareness around it actually start to change things? That actually, is incredibly important to an investment process.
So, does the firm approve of the article?
The article represents my point of view. It does not represent my employer. There are people within the firm that agree. There are people inside the firm that disagree. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
And my camera got shut off when you asked that question. No, the simple reality is I'm very fortunate to have a role at a firm that is supportive of my search for intellectual curiosity and truth. And in no way does it represent the opinion of the firm or our investors.
Okay. Okay. So, I mean, do you want to run for politics one day? I mean,
I have absolutely no desire to run for political office. I'm a father with three children who are largely grown now. And as I say often, this is no longer a story about me. I'm old enough that I've run my race. I did reasonably well. As I like to say, I finished somewhere around, 737,000th out of 8 billion people. That's pretty good. I'm happy with that. But as I look at the world going forward and how I can influence it over the next 10 to 15 years, a part of it is actually calling out these truths and identifying areas where we can improve. No desire for political office, would be a terrible political candidate. I am too intellectually curious to sit in one seat and do the same thing day after day after day. But I do think that we can actually find people who reflect this point of view, and I'm going to spend some time doing that over the next couple of months as we head towards the midterm elections.
Yeah, I mean, well, it was a sensational article. If anything, it makes you think, and it opens up the discussion, which obviously is warranted. Let's turn the page to the Fed, though, entirely about the Fed. So,
Yep.
with the meeting tomorrow, we are expecting a number of dissents. So we're not expecting a clean sweep 12-0, even an 11-1 vote for cutting rates. What does that tell you, though? Say we do get, say, an 8-4 or a 7-5 where we cut 25 basis points. Do you think that could be a bullish sign or a bearish sign for the markets?
Well, anytime there is uncertainty that is created, that is bearish for markets.
Okay.
It's just that simple. I do agree that the prospect of dissenting opinions are relatively high. I think that is unfortunately largely speaking to the political makeup of the Fed at this point. Individuals like Stephen Moran or others who are potentially angling for positions, going forward with Jerome Powell stepping down in May, are using this as an opportunity to raise their public profile, right? Who are you? Oh, I'm Chris Waller. I dissented at the last opinion, right? See, look, I have an independent voice on this. Um, so I think the dissents that we're seeing right now have two sources. One is the political and career aspirations of the participants that are dissenting, far more so than any philosophical difference. But I also think that the other important thing that we're actually seeing with the Fed is a genuine uncertainty that is created by what I describe as a complete lack of a theory of why we do what we do from the leadership, right? I just think Jerome Powell is among the worst Fed chairs we've ever had. He has no real concept of why he's doing what he's doing.
So as that change in leadership, though, I mean, Jerome Powell, he might have senioritis at this point. I mean, he actually, since the last meeting, he's the only official who refused to speak to the press. He wasn't giving any type of public comments. He wasn't giving speeches, whereas everyone else was. What does that tell you, though? I mean, do you think he's just throwing in the towel, just saying I just want out at this point, or is he going to finish this thing through and try to still hit that 2% target?
Um, I, I mean, the quick answer is I do think that there is an element of throwing in the towel. I also think that there's a recognition that anything that he said would simply drive more volatility and response at this point, right? The rest of the Fed has become the Fed itself has always been a political creature. It has never been an independent creature. The reality is it's a little bit like saying I have a strong CFO within an executive organization, right? Can they behave independently? No, they can't because the overall business is actually an integrated entity. And so the Fed responds to fiscal policy responds to monetary policy, and so on. Um, what we're seeing, as I said, is this has been elevated. Like the roles have been elevated to the point that everybody knows who the Fed chair is, right? If you were to go back into the 1960s or 1970s, or really even into much of the 1990s, you wouldn't have had anyone really knowing who was the person who was in charge of monetary policy, and you certainly wouldn't have known who the Fed governors were, et cetera, right? This is esoteric language that never should make the public news. Um, it's become a very powerful entity with an incredible amount of influence on how people behave on a day-to-day basis. And as a result, you see people angling for these roles. I just think that's really what's going on right now is
Mhm.
everybody's just, I think the teen equivalent is they're all pick me girls now, right? They're doing things to draw attention to their position.
The change in leadership, it looks like Kevin Hassett has the inside rail here on getting the position to take over as chairman. He's very dovish, as you know. If that's the case, we could probably, or Wall Street will anticipate further rate cuts that will be quite aggressive in 2026. What is your take on the markets? Do you think that the economy has a possibility of overheating? Will that have a negative impact on stocks? Let's say you.
Well, first, I think that interest rates actually influence equity markets in a very different manner than most people think. The vast majority of assets at this point are run using systematic allocation frameworks where people basically say, okay, I've got a 50-50 bond equity portfolio. I'm just using that as a simple example. When the Fed hikes interest rates, its primary impact is to lower the prices of bonds. Right. Now, if you think about a bond portfolio, a portfolio that's 50-50 bonds and equities, if I've reduced the price of bonds, now my bond allocation falls. Therefore, I need to sell equities to buy bonds. Nowhere in that calculation did I do a discounted cash flow calculation about forward expectations of earnings or cash flow or anything else. And I think that phenomenon, what's called the portfolio rebalance effect, is largely responsible for why anyone pays attention to the Fed at this point. Almost nobody is doing a discounted cash flow analysis or a formal modeling of the securities anymore.
Hmm.
And so that's why I think we care. Now, is there anything that the Fed is going to do in the next series of meetings that meaningfully change bond prices to a level that would require rebalancing? There's nothing like the 21 to 23 time period where interest rates were hiked from 0 to 5.5% to drive a radical change in bond prices. And so I think by and large, this is all a sideshow. It's
Hmm.
really a question about the broader economy. Are we starting to see job loss? Are we starting to see a reduction in labor force that's going to meaningfully impact our forward outlook as compared to this portfolio rebalance nonsense where the Fed is changing interest rates?
Interesting. Final question for you. 2026, what's your overall outlook for the markets, and do you have a favorite theme at this time?
Well, my theme has been twofold. One is that I think because of the way that we invest, going back to that same topic, very few people understand how high real interest rates are in a historical context. And so if I think about things like US TIPS, Treasury inflation protected securities, the yields on those are actually remarkably high given our expectations for how the economy is supposed to develop. So I constantly encourage people to take an active look at the real returns that can be generated in fixed income that are often lost in the way that we invest today. The second thing, though, that I would highlight is that the behavior in the fixed income market is very much influenced by people's perception of inflation and reported inflation. And there's a mechanical process that will actually cause inflation to be relatively elevated on a reporting basis until give or take March. It's a seasonal adjustment issue that's tied to the combination of the COVID pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine that influence prices in a seasonally atypical manner that's still rolling through. So through the first part of the year, to answer the question, I'm a little bit concerned about the bond market. I'm a little concerned that interest rates on the back end could continue to rise, and that will put some pressure on the bond market. But as I look beyond that point, I think that we have a much more deflationary condition in front of us that would be supportive of much lower interest rates. The
Okay.
other the other
Oh, go ahead.
issue that I would just emphasize is on the stock market itself. As long as people have jobs, as long as people are contributing to 401ks, as long as they are sending money blindly to the largest companies in a disproportionate fashion because of passive allocations, it's really hard to get markets to go down
Just off of the systematic investing.
just off of the flows. Like to give you some idea, Todd, at this point, I
Yeah.
estimate that the mechanical process of how we invest is adding about 12 to 1300 basis points, 12 to 13% a year to the returns of the S&P 500. It's why large cap growth has been the top performing strategy in 8 of the last 9 years by measures that nobody could have anticipated, even as people using valuation based.
Okay. So years ago, let me ask you this. Years ago, when I worked, one final question for you. When I was working at Merrill Lynch, I remember we had 50% of Americans were invested in the markets. You'd have, whether it be through a 401k, an IRA, maybe a stock option plan, some other indirect or way
Mhm.
that they were investing. So 50%, one out of every two. What are the percentages now, if you know?
It's about 65% of households are invested in the stock market through the 401ks, et cetera. But you're a very young man, Todd. So I just want to emphasize like how rapid that change is.
Yeah,
So in 1929, it was about 10% of American households. By the 1950s, it was about 7% of American households. So you can see how that could fall. All
yeah.
right. And as late as about 2002, it was only about 35 to 40% of all households were invested in the US equity markets. Today, it's over 65%. And so you've seen how rapidly that has changed. That's been a key shift over your career and my career. And today, we have to ask ourselves, what does it look like as we're talking about more marginal investors, new children being born, given Trump accounts, et cetera? It's a little bit like, voting, right? We enfranchised everybody, and now we're basically saying, well, who else could we enfranchise, right? Who can we give rights to? And the answer is now, brand newborn children.
Yeah, yeah, no doubt about that. And we will see how those Trump accounts work is, and also with the Dell family coming in to help add to those accounts and supplement that. So that's a big deal, and I think we'll see a lot of benefits down the line anyway on that one. Michael, I want to thank you for joining me today. This was a fantastic conversation, very educational. I know the audience will get a lot out of it as well. I do hope to have you back, and I wish you and your family a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Thank you. Same to you, Todd, and to your listeners.
Thank you, Michael. So on behalf of Michael Green, I am Todd Schoenberger. Thank you once again for joining us on The Money Path. Coming up on Thursday is the debut episode of Miss Schneider's Financial Compass. You will not want to miss it. It airs live at 12 noon. Can't wait to see you. Take care.
Access real-time data and intelligent analytics exactly when you need them. Get the right data at the right time. Learn more at quotemedia.com.